All right, guys, this is another one. A brainwashed student, a skeptical student who tries to bring his knowledge and challenge the great Frank Turek. And if you don't know who Frank is a Christian apologist who goes around, I think, different university campuses, goes to different sort of events and gives an answer for his faith. Teaches Christians how to defend their faith, and it sort of provides Christians and people with common questions that people have. You know, if God is real, then why did this happen? If God is so loving, then why did He allow my child to be essayed or to be killed somehow? And he gives valid answers. He gives Christians a place to start and how to tackle those very difficult questions that I'm sure that we've each faced at some point in our Christian lives, whether that be a question that we've actually had in our own heart. You know what, God, how could you allow my family member to pass away? Or God, why did you allow that, allow me to be made redundant at work? You know, sometimes we may have those questions and those are deep questions, they're real and they're true, but there are answers. The Bible gives answers for these things. And what Frank does is teach believers how to answer those questions, especially those questions that come from atheists. So even questions about how old the earth is and why the Big Bang isn't to be believed or why God is real, all these things. He really gives an answer. But I'm not going to waste much time. I'm going to let us go into this video. Let's get into it.
If you don't trust the Bible and ancient texts, what could make you believe in the resurrection?
If you don't, well, I guess my question would be, why wouldn't you trust these ancient texts if you evaluate them and you come to the conclusion they're historically reliable? Why would this be invented? That kind of thing. Go ahead.
You don't come to the conclusion that they're historically reliable.
Okay, my question would be, why do you think they're not?
Because they were written 100, 200 years later.
Later than what?
Later than when Jesus was crucified.
Where did you come up with those dates?
Google.
Huh?
I don't think you know how crazy that is. Look where he is. From what I can understand, this looks like a university campus. They don't all look like university students. If I had my guess, I think we've got an individual here who's probably not in university. Here, from what I can see in that faded area, looks like he might be a veteran. I reckon this is some sort of seminar and event where these people have been welcomed to this location and they are hearing, trying to listen, trying to learn. And we've got this individual who has been given the opportunity to get on the mic in a public forum and to confidently say that the information he stands upon was obtained from Google. And to say it with his chest. He said it so confidently. I don't know how you could do that. I think you have to say, right, I read this in this literature, written by this person who has expertise in this area. You can't stand upon Google. And Frank does go on to make a little bit of a joke about it.
I just looked it up. It was like 100. It was written, or published, the Hebrew Bible was published around 100 AC. He was killed in 30 AC. The life expectancy is probably shorter then. And instead it was published, so that's like 7 years. They were already 30 or 40, so they're either old and senile or dead, so.
Run those dates by me again.
It was 100 when the Hebrew Bible was published about, because we don't actually know. And then 30 when he was killed.
The Hebrew Bible, you mean the Old Testament?
No, it said, well, how would they publish the Old Testament after he died?
No, we have Old Testament documents prior to Jesus.
Okay.
We have the Septuagint, which was 250 BC. So that's 250 years prior to Jesus. We have the whole, we have Dead Sea Scrolls. We have a scroll, the entire book of Isaiah from like 150 BC. So the Old Testament's written before Jesus. You get that, right?
Yeah, but when was it published? Do you know?
What do you mean published?
Well,
yeah. What what do you actually mean by published? Do you think some of these publishing companies, HarperCollins and so on, decided, yeah, we're going to now publish and release the Bible and put it into print? Is that what he means by published? Because there was no publishing company back then, my friend.
Yeah, I can show you what it said. Like it said, it was.
If it's on the internet, it's got to be true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so when was the Bible published?
Okay. First.
Now, that's the sort of question, if he came on the mic with that question, when was the Bible published? Because I'm having a few doubts about it. Totally different response, I think, from Frank, from the audience, from myself, really. Because that is a question that sort of invokes an answer that would be one that cares, that this person is asking a question because there's something that concerns them, having doubts. He hasn't come with a puffed chest. He hasn't come with a reliance on Google. He's come out of a curiosity in his mind to really get down to the bottom of some of the questions that are bothering him.
The documents we call the New Testament were written anywhere between, say, 40 AD and I believe 70 AD. Okay? Jesus was crucified in 33 AD. Okay? Now, the sources inside those documents go all the way back to the event of the resurrection itself. In fact, the earliest evidence for the resurrection is recorded in a passage we call 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, where Paul says, "What I received of first importance I pass on to you." So Paul is writing in about 55 AD to the church at Corinth in Greece, and he's quoting a section that was memorized that even atheistic scholars agree goes all the way back near 33 AD. And that section talks about who Jesus appeared to after he was resurrected. So despite the fact that Paul is writing it in 55 AD, about 22 years after the resurrection event, the data that Paul is writing down goes all the way back to the event itself. It would be like today if you wanted to write a history of, say, 9/11, which is 22 years ago, and you went and interviewed eyewitnesses. Some of them are in this room. And they told you what happened. Would it matter that you wrote it 22 years later? Or would the source from the event itself be authoritative?
You could lose it in translation from what they saw memorized for 20 years and then you publish.
I mean, what he's saying is true. If there was an event that happened many years ago and you're writing about it, I'd even go as far as to say 6 months later, that there is a lot of detail you're going to miss. But I think the point Frank is trying to get at, which he's going to go on to say in a moment, is that you may forget detail. You may forget, let me use an example. You got into a severe car accident where you happened to break a bone. You broke your ankle and you couldn't walk for a year while they had to put in, I don't know, these metal caps or whatever in your ankle to sort of stabilize the bone. And only after a year could you ever actually put weight back on it. If 4 years down the line, you are asked to recount that event and write a book about it, you may forget the color of the jumper you were wearing. You may forget the color of the car that hit you. You may even forget, I doubt it, but you may forget how fast you were traveling. You may forget your location. But you're not going to forget the fact that you actually had an accident and you broke your ankle. You may forget some finer detail, but the actual event, the prime event, you're not going to forget. You're not going to get that wrong. You're not going to get into an accident where you broke your ankle and say, I think I just tripped and actually broke my shoulder. You're not going to get the most important detail about the event that wrong. And that's what Frank's basically saying. He's going to go on to say that now.
You could misremember things, but there's something known as an impact event. An impact event is something you don't forget. You might forget what you had for breakfast this morning, but you won't you won't forget something that happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago if you're old enough. Now, you're not. There may be a couple of us in here that are this old. Let me ask a question. Only a few of you are going to raise your hand. How many people in here can remember where you were and what you were doing November 22nd, 1963? Raise your hand and hold it up. You see these people with their hands up? These people are very old. Okay? November 22nd, 1963 is my earliest memory. I was 2 years old and 2 days. And I'm standing in the living room in our home in Wanamassett, New Jersey, and my mother is sitting on an ottoman in front of a black and white TV, weeping uncontrollably. Mommy, what's the matter? They killed the president. They killed the president. President Kennedy assassinated that day. I can still see in my mind right now my mother when she was 26 years old, sitting on that ottoman. She's 86 today, but I can see her when she was 26. I remember what I said to her. And I remember what she said to me. And that was 60 years ago. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? You remember where you were and what you were doing. Why? Because it was an impact event. Now, if Jesus rose from the dead, do you think that would have been an impact event?
I just love how Frank deals with some of these questions. I think the key thing that Frank does is he understands the question that's being asked, and he tries to understand the motive behind it. And I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing him to Jesus, although all believers should be compared to Jesus because he lives in us and transforms us into his likeness. But it very much reminds me of when the Pharisees and those his naysayers are asking questions but have evil intention behind them, whether to catch him out, whether to make him look stupid, or really to make him say something that would end up causing him to be immediately arrested and put to death. So often it's said, you'll see the Bible verse say, and Jesus knowing their thoughts, or and Jesus knowing their minds answered and said, or and Jesus knowing that they tried to capture him suddenly left the vicinity of where they were. There's many verses that go on to describe interactions that Jesus has had with Pharisees and some of the Sadducees and whatnot. But I think Frank does a good job at understanding the question and the motive behind it. Sometimes he knows that the question actually comes from somebody who's got some really hard problems understanding the Christian faith, understanding who wrote the Bible and when, and whether we can trust that men wrote the Bible. And I think this is one of those cases where this brainwashed or skeptic student has information from Google and has not used that to question his belief, but has used that to defend his belief. And I think that they're quite different.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think they would have forgotten about it? Do you think they would have any trouble remembering what he said and did?
Possibly.
Probably not, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so just like you
can't even be honest. The answer is the likelihood that they would have forgotten an event like Jesus dying and rising up is slim. None of us would forget it.
Interview people here today about 9/11 and get an accurate account. So could the New Testament writers, and many of them were eyewitnesses themselves. So I don't know where you're reading this kind of thing, but the New Testament documents are written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, by eyewitnesses or people that knew eyewitnesses. For example, Luke, who was a doctor and interviewed eyewitnesses, actually puts forth a very accurate account of what he said he saw, and you can verify this by looking at archaeological remains and geographic remains and topography from the Gospel of Luke and also the book of Acts. In fact, there's 84 details in the book of Acts alone that have been proven to be eyewitness data just from chapter 13 to chapter 28, the end of the book. Luke was actually traveling with Paul. He's an eyewitness of that period. So you're right. You know, if this was 100 or 200 years later, we might be skeptical of it. But when we have eyewitnesses and eyewitness data that can be confirmed, that's telling us that this really could be true. Let me say one other thing. We just did a podcast on this 2 days ago. It's the podcast up right now, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. There have been 7 people associated with the crucifixion of Jesus found in archaeology. 7 of them, including Jesus himself. Jesus, Caiaphas, Simon of Cyrene, Pilate, Herod, Peter, and one other I can't remember right now. 7 names from the 1st century have been found in the dirt that are mentioned in the crucifixion account of Jesus. All told, there are more than 30 names in the New Testament that have been found in archaeology and other writings from the time. This is not an invented story.
Can I?
Go ahead.
But that, just because their names are there doesn't mean he rose from the dead.
No, it doesn't. But it does show that they're telling historical facts.
Yeah, very, very, very profound point that Frank's made. You know, the person who wrote it, the book that they're referring to, has also mentioned names that can be verified. It's a bit like if I said, do you know what? I went to see the president and Bob Douglas, I'm just making up any name, Bob Douglas was there with me, and Jennifer Aniston was there with me. Well, if you can't verify that those names are actually of people that exist and that existed at the time, then you can't really believe what I'm saying, because I've mentioned 2 names. So if you really want to check the facts of what I'm saying, look into Bob Douglas and say, does Bob Douglas exist? Is there any proof that I know that Bob Douglas, or that Bob Douglas knows the person we went to meet? Does Jennifer Aniston exist? I know this is a name of someone who's real, but it was the first name that came into my head. Does she exist? Do I know this individual? And if the answer to those questions is no, that person does not exist, or did not exist around the time that myself lived, then you must be telling a lie, because the very 2 names that you gave cannot be verified. Whereas the New Testament writer has given names that can be verified. And so the likelihood is that he's probably telling the truth. But then we also have to remember that many of the writers had no incentive to lie. A lot of times people think, we can't trust the Bible, it was written by man. It was a bunch of men that got together and wrote this elaborate story. Okay, to what end? What did they benefit? What did they think they'd get out of it? It wasn't money, because anyone who declared their faith in Jesus Christ was persecuted. The Pharisees, the leaders of the temple, of the Jewish, of the faith then, they wanted to kill Christians, kill anybody that spoke of Jesus Christ as being the Son of God. There was no riches in it for them. They had no incentive to lie. In fact, they had every right to do the opposite. They had every right to lie and say, do you know what? We didn't see him rise, and Jesus is not the Son of God, to save their souls, because they were going to be killed for what they were saying. And many of them were martyred. They were killed. It said that Peter, the New Testament writer, was put on a cross, and was put on a cross upside down. He chose to go upside down because he did not think he was worthy to die in the same manner as Christ, who was obviously, as we know, crucified the right side up with his hands stretched out and his legs pinned to the cross. Some were stoned to death. So they knew that this is going to be the outcome of the things they're saying. When they saw that that had happened to one of them, they could have said, you know what, guys, let's change our story. Let's change our story, lest we be stoned like our brother was. Let's change the story. Let's just say that Christ didn't rise. But they didn't do that. They kept to what they had seen. And I think that makes them trustworthy.
And so if people can be trusted on where you can verify them, you probably ought to trust them where you can't. Now, if Jesus really did rise from the dead, would you follow him?
Yeah. I knew you were going to ask this earlier.
Yeah.
That is a deep question. For any atheist, anyone of any other faith, that tells you how wrong you are for believing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and died and rose again, say to them, if Christianity was true, would you follow Jesus? And many a times the answer is no. Because it's not, and Frank does this so well. He goes on to say, not in this video, but in another one, he goes on to say, the reason why the answer to that is no is because it's not a head thing. It's not that people can't understand this story of Jesus Christ. It's because their heart refuses to try and comprehend it. It's a heart thing, not a head thing.
Sure.
Okay. Well, how much reading have you really done on this?
I'm just going to end it there because you can see from this guy's answer, he says, sure, no, you will not. If you found out, if all the evidence was presented to you and you actually believed the evidence, people like to point to science, there's no scientific evidence for it. If science was brought before you and says, do you know what, guys, we got it all wrong. Science actually shows Jesus Christ was real and he died and rose again and is the Son of God. It doesn't mean that he's going to follow him because it's a heart thing. It's not a head thing. A head thing is, do you know what? I can't understand how 2 + 2 = 4. I'm not quite understanding. It's not adding up. And so for those individuals, I guess it's easier to address because all you need to do is bring evidence to help them comprehend why 2 + 2 = 4. But for the individuals where it's a heart matter, it doesn't matter if you can prove how 2 and 2 = 4. Their heart is just not into it. It doesn't matter what you say, I'm not going to do it because they want to be their own God. If you believe Jesus Christ is God, it means that you have to submit yourself to him and do as he says. But people don't want to do that. They don't want to be told what to do. They want to be their own gods and live how they want to live. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this one. That's it from me. Peace.